like dwarves. You're not meant to say dwarf anymore. You're meant to say little people. But I don't like the term little people one bit. Because little, a bit patronising, and people, come on, that's a stretch. Dwarfism is a growing problem. I had a dwarf come up to me after a show. Well, not right up to me, up to about there. He wasn't angry, but he was a little short with me. He was not happy. It's no laughing matter, really. I had a friend that was a dwarf who died last year. He actually took his own life. Yeah, committed suicide. Jumped off a curb.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, February the 21st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for retrogrades, and the Mossad. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you, and now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Supply-side economics began as a policy system alternative to Keynesian demand-side models. It was based on a policy mix that delivered price stability through monetary discipline and economic stimulation of employment and growth through the tax and regulatory systems. It concluded that cuts in marginal tax rates were needed to create output incentives to spur the economy, and tight money would produce price stability. The economy embarked on one of its longest ever expansions at the same time that inflation was increasingly brought under control. The new policy shifted the Phillips curve downward and to the left, allowing unemployment and inflation to decrease at the same time. Robert A. Mundell. The policy mix the great Mundell refers to came out of the early 1980s and helped promote one of the great periods of prosperity in world history. The Volcker-led Fed embarked upon the politically unpopular decision to raise rates until monetary excess was extracted from the system, at the same time that output exploded as supply-side tax cuts produced substantial incentives for productivity. Much of economic theory is, well, theory, and is rooted in analysis and logical adjudication. The statements here are more empirical. The Phillips curve theory that growth and inflation were positively correlated was turned on its head, as growth came out of marginal tax cuts and price stability came out of counter-inflationary.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Dr. Berg.
If you wake up to pee at night, it's not your bladder. It's something completely different. How many times did you wake up last night to pee? Once? Twice? More than that? So many people that get up through the night think that they have a prostate problem or a weak bladder. You're going to learn today it has nothing to do with that. And if you get up even once a night, you're going to be extremely happy that you watched this video, because I'm going to show you how to fix it very quickly. So the first thing you need to know is there's a hormone involved. It's called the anti-diuretic hormone. Now think about what that means. It means anti-you urinating excessively. So this hormone is super important in the prevention of excessive urination, especially at night. The first thing that will affect it is having an imbalance of too much salt and not enough potassium. This is very common. So right there, that's going to affect the kidneys. That's going to create a problem. Your body's going to want to get rid of this excess salt, so it's going to cause more urine to be produced. Other things that mess with this hormone would be too much caffeine. That's why it's important just to have like a small amount of caffeine in the morning. Don't overdo it. Some really key nutrients that are involved with bladder control are vitamin B1 and magnesium. B1 has everything to do with the part of the nervous system that controls, especially the bladder. But in order for B1 to work, it needs magnesium. So these two are really important, especially if you urinate in the middle of the night and not a lot of urine comes out.
And that was Dr. Berg. Back in a minute.
If you're too nice, people don't respect you. They overlook you. They take you for granted. They walk over you. Most people think warmth earns respect, so they smile constantly. They say yes to everything. They worry about being liked. But real respect doesn't come from being nice. It comes from being controlled, deliberate, unshakable. Here are 5 cold behaviors that change everything. 1. Stop explaining yourself. Make a decision. Own it. The moment you over-explain, you signal insecurity. Confident people don't seek approval. They move forward. 2. Embrace silence after disrespect. Don't argue. Don't defend. Go quiet. Silence forces them to face their behavior while you stay composed. 3. Never chase validation. Not in business, not in relationships. Desperation repels. Indifference attracts. When you stop chasing, they notice. 4. Set boundaries without apology. Say no. Clearly. No excuses. I'm not available for that is a complete sentence. 5. Show zero reaction to provocation. Your calm is your weapon. Emotional control signals power. It tells the world you cannot be manipulated. And here comes the most important part. Warmth without strength is weakness. Respect is earned through self-mastery. Your composure is your power. Your boundaries are your dignity. Master them, and respect becomes inevitable.
Thank you. And now, the Mossad.
West Berlin, January 1988. Snow falls on the divided city as a man known only by his codename prepares for another mission against Israeli targets in Europe. Intelligence services across 3 continents have hunted him for 6 years, tracking a trail of blood that stretches from Vienna to Paris to Athens. Tonight, in a cramped apartment overlooking the Kurfürstendamm, the sniper called the Red Wolf will discover that Mossad has finally found his desk. The file that landed on the desk of Mossad's operations chief in Tel Aviv during the summer of 1982 contained photographs of aftermath that no intelligence professional could view without revulsion. A synagogue in Vienna with its windows blown inward, worshippers cut down during Sabbath services. A Jewish restaurant in Paris, where diners had been methodically executed. A cultural center in Brussels, where a lone gunman had killed 7 people before vanishing into crowds that parted in terror. The attacks shared characteristics that analysts recognized immediately: precision shooting, careful planning, and an escape methodology that suggested professional training far beyond what most terrorist operatives possessed. The perpetrator of at least 3 of these attacks had earned a codename within Israeli intelligence that reflected both his political affiliations and his preferred method of operation. The Red Wolf combined ideological commitment to Marxist-Leninist revolutionary movements with the patient discipline of a trained sniper, a combination that made him extraordinarily dangerous and exceptionally difficult to locate. Unlike bombers who could be traced through procurement of materials or suicide attackers whose networks could be penetrated through recruitment channels, a lone sniper operating with professional tradecraft could strike and disappear with minimal exposure to the intelligence methods that had proven effective against other terrorist threats. The man behind the codename had been born Mahmoud Khalid Hassan in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon during 1953, his childhood shaped by the dispossession and violence that characterized life in the camps during the decades following Israeli independence. His path toward becoming one of the most wanted terrorists in Europe began not with religious radicalism but with secular revolutionary politics, the Marxist ideologies that swept through Palestinian movements during the 1960s and 70s. He joined the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine while still a teenager, distinguishing himself through aptitude for weapons and a cold temperament that impressed instructors who had trained hundreds of fighters. The transformation from ordinary PFLP militant to specialized assassin occurred during training provided by Soviet bloc intelligence services that maintained relationships with Palestinian factions throughout the Cold War. East German instructors from the Stasi's Foreign Operations Directorate recognized in Hassan a potential that exceeded the capabilities of most recruits, recommending him for advanced programs that few Palestinians accessed. He spent 18 months in the German Democratic Republic, learning techniques that would later be applied against targets his instructors had never anticipated, the methods of a state security apparatus repurposed for terrorist operations across Western Europe. The sniper training that Hassan received transformed him from a competent fighter into a precision instrument of terror. He learned to calculate windage and elevation across distances that most marksmen never attempted, to select positions that offered both optimal firing solutions and viable escape routes, and to maintain the psychological discipline required for operations where patience measured success. The rifle became an extension of his body, the mechanics of shooting so thoroughly internalized that conscious thought no longer intervened between target acquisition and trigger pull. When he emerged from training facilities in the German Democratic Republic, he possessed capabilities that few terrorists in any organization could match. The first attack attributed to the Red Wolf occurred in Vienna during September of 1981, though Israeli intelligence would not connect it to subsequent operations for nearly a year. A sniper positioned in a building overlooking a synagogue fired 7 shots through windows during Saturday morning services, killing 4 worshippers and wounding 9 others before escaping through pre-planned routes that took him across the Austrian border within hours. The Austrian police investigation recovered shell casings and bullet fragments, but generated no leads on the shooter's identity. The attack seemingly emerging from nowhere and disappearing back into the void. The methodology that distinguished the Red Wolf from other terrorist snipers became apparent only when subsequent attacks revealed consistent patterns that analysts could study. He favored urban environments where multiple escape routes, complicated pursuit, and where the chaos following gunfire provided cover for withdrawal. He selected targets that would generate maximum psychological impact on Jewish communities throughout Europe, demonstrating that no sanctuary existed beyond the reach of those committed to violence. He operated alone during the execution phase, reducing the exposure that came from coordination with others and eliminating the possibility that captured accomplices might reveal information about future operations. The intelligence effort to identify and locate the Red Wolf began in earnest following the Paris attack in March of 1982, when a gunman entered a Jewish restaurant near the Marais district and killed 6 people with methodical shots that witnesses described as almost mechanical in their precision. French investigators determined that the weapon had been a rifle of Eastern European manufacture, and ballistic analysis suggested the same shooter might have been responsible for the Vienna attack 6 months earlier. This connection transformed what had appeared to be isolated incidents into a pattern, and patterns could be analyzed, understood, and ultimately exploited. Mossad's initial approach focused on penetrating the networks that might have supported such operations. The infrastructure of safe houses, document forgers, and logistical facilitators that enabled terrorists to operate across European borders. Agents cultivated sources within Palestinian communities throughout Western Europe, seeking information about individuals who might possess the specialized skills that the attacks demonstrated. The search proved frustrating, as the Red Wolf's operational methodology minimized contact with support networks that might be compromised. He appeared to operate with a degree of independence that few terrorists achieved, maintaining separation from organizations whose security could not be guaranteed. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to Berlin came from an unexpected direction, not from human sources within terrorist networks, but from the liaison relationships that Mossad maintained with Western European intelligence services. A German federal intelligence officer shared information about a Palestinian who had received training in the German Democratic Republic and subsequently disappeared from monitoring, a man whose skills matched the profile that Israeli analysts had developed. The name Mahmoud Khaled Hassan entered Mossad's files for the first time in late 1982, though years would pass before the connection between the name and the attacks could be confirmed. The confirmation came through patient accumulation of evidence that gradually closed the circle around the Red Wolf. A witness in Brussels who had glimpsed the shooter's face provided description that matched photographs of Hassan from Lebanese sources. Financial transfers traced through multiple jurisdictions revealed patterns consistent with someone receiving support from PFLP networks while maintaining operational independence. Communication intercepts suggested that Palestinian leadership discussed a valuable asset in Europe whose activities required protection and support, though the intercepts never identified the asset by name. Each piece of evidence added weight to the assessment that Hassan and the Red Wolf were the same person. The operational challenge of locating a target who had proven so successful at avoiding detection required methods that departed from standard approaches. Traditional surveillance assumed knowledge of a target's location, but Hassan moved frequently and unpredictably, never establishing patterns that could be exploited. Human intelligence required access to individuals who knew his whereabouts, but his operational security limited such knowledge to a handful of PFLP leaders whose communications were heavily guarded. Technical collection faced similar obstacles, as Hassan avoided electronic communications that might reveal his location. Finding him would require either extraordinary luck or the development of new approaches tailored to his specific vulnerabilities. The vulnerability that Mossad identified centered on the support infrastructure that even the most independent operative required for sustained operations. Hassan might execute attacks alone, but he needed documents, weapons, and safe locations that could only come from networks with presence across Europe. By mapping these networks and placing them under comprehensive surveillance, Israeli intelligence created a web that would register any contact Hassan made with the support structure his operations required. The strategy demanded patience and resources that only a service with Mossad's capabilities could sustain, but it offered the prospect of eventually detecting a target who had proven invisible through conventional methods. The web registered its first significant contact in the autumn of 1985 when surveillance of a known PFLP facilitator in Frankfurt documented a meeting with an individual whose appearance matched the description of Hassan. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes, and occurred in public spaces designed to frustrate surveillance. But observers captured photographs that confirmed the identification. For the first time, Mossad possessed confirmation that the Red Wolf remained active in Europe and maintained connections to networks that could be monitored. The hunt that had begun as analysis of attack patterns now had a confirmed target, whose location might eventually be determined. The years between initial identification and the Berlin operation reflected the difficulties inherent in locating a target who understood surveillance and employed sophisticated countermeasures. Hassan appeared briefly in Munich during 1986. His presence detected through the same network monitoring that had revealed the Frankfurt contact, but he vanished before any operational response could be mounted. A reported sighting in Amsterdam during 1987 could not be confirmed, and the source who provided it subsequently proved unreliable. The Red Wolf seemed to understand that his survival depended on constant movement and minimal exposure, behaviors that frustrated even the most patient hunters. The Berlin dimension entered the picture through intelligence, suggesting that Hassan had established a relationship with Stasi officers who had trained him years earlier, a connection that might provide sanctuary in East Berlin, where Western intelligence services could not easily operate. The divided city offered unique advantages to someone seeking to evade surveillance, with the wall creating a barrier that separated hunting grounds from safe territory. Hassan could operate in West Berlin while retreating to the east when pressure mounted, exploiting Cold War geography in ways that complicated any operation against him. Understanding this pattern would prove essential to the operation that eventually cornered him. The winter of 1987 brought intelligence that transformed the prolonged hunt into an operational opportunity. Sources reported that Hassan had received orders for an attack against Israeli diplomatic personnel in West Berlin, an operation that PFLP leadership considered strategically valuable given the symbolic significance of the divided city. The attack was scheduled for January of 1988, timing that would coincide with diplomatic events that would bring Israeli officials to the city. For the first time, Mossad possessed advanced knowledge of both the target's location and his intended actions, information that enabled planning for an operation that would end the Red Wolf's career. The operational planning that preceded the Berlin operation involved coordination across multiple Mossad divisions and collaboration with allied services that had their own reasons for wanting Hassan neutralized. The keyed-on unit that would execute the operation began preparing in December, studying the Berlin environment and developing approaches that accounted for the city's unique characteristics. The presence of the wall complicated extraction scenarios, as any operation in West Berlin had to assume that the target might attempt to flee eastward, where pursuit would be impossible. The plan that emerged reflected these constraints while exploiting vulnerabilities that Hassan's operational pattern had revealed. The surveillance team that deployed to West Berlin in early January 1988 faced weather conditions that complicated their mission while potentially aiding their concealment. Snow fell heavily throughout the first week of the month, blanketing the city in white that muffled sounds and reduced visibility. The cold kept pedestrians indoors when possible, thinning the crowds that might normally provide cover for surveillance detection. The weather created challenges for maintaining observation posts, but also reduced the likelihood that the target would notice watchers whose presence might otherwise have attracted attention. The identification of Hassan's location came through surveillance of a contact he was expected to meet, a PFLP logistics operative whose movements had been monitored for months. When the contact traveled to an apartment building in the Charlottenburg district, observers established positions that would detect any visitors. The building's location offered Hassan access to routes leading toward crossing points into East Berlin, while remaining within the operating environment of West Berlin, where the planned attack would occur. The address that surveillance identified became the focal point for an operation that would unfold over the following 10 days. The confirmation that Hassan occupied the apartment came through technical means that supplemented visual observation. Equipment deployed in adjacent buildings detected communications and activity patterns consistent with occupation by someone maintaining operational security. The telephone line serving the apartment showed no activity, suggesting that the occupant avoided communications that might be monitored. Movement patterns within the apartment, detected through sensors that registered vibrations, indicated a single occupant who maintained regular routines while remaining largely invisible from the street. Every indicator supported the assessment that the Red Wolf had been located. The operational parameters established for the Berlin mission reflected both the opportunity that Hassan's location presented and the constraints that the environment imposed. The execution would need to occur in circumstances that prevented escape to East Berlin, eliminating the sanctuary that Cold War geography otherwise provided. The timing would need to account for weather conditions that affected visibility, movement, and the behavior of potential witnesses. The method would need to ensure that Hassan could not survive to reveal information about Mossad's penetration of PFLP networks, a consideration that influenced decisions about how the operation would be conducted. The team assigned to execute the operation included specialists whose skills matched the requirements of urban operations in challenging environments. The leader, identified in later accounts only by his operational codename, had conducted similar missions in European cities and understood the particular demands of operating in Berlin. His team included surveillance specialists who would track Hassan's movements once he left the apartment, weapons experts who would ensure that the equipment deployed functioned despite the cold, and extraction specialists who would manage the withdrawal once the operation concluded. Each member understood their role and the contingencies that might require adaptation. The opportunity for action came on the evening of January 15th, when surveillance detected Hassan leaving his apartment for the first time in 3 days. His movement pattern suggested preparation for the attack that intelligence indicated was imminent, a reconnaissance of locations where Israeli diplomatic personnel would be present. The team that had maintained watch through days of waiting activated protocols that had been rehearsed repeatedly, positions shifting to cover routes that Hassan might follow, while assault elements prepared for execution scenarios that planning had anticipated. Hassan's route took him along the Kurfürstendamm, the famous shopping boulevard that remained busy despite the cold and the hour. The snow that had fallen throughout the week lined the streets in banks that pedestrians navigated around, the white surfaces reflecting streetlights in ways that aided observation while creating shadows that complicated assessment. The target walked with the awareness of someone who understood surveillance, his gaze sweeping streets and windows in patterns designed to detect watchers. The team tracking him maintained distance that his counter-surveillance could not penetrate, while coordinating movements that would bring assault elements into position. The execution occurred in a side street off the main boulevard, a location that the target entered while conducting what appeared to be a surveillance detection route. The narrow street offered reduced visibility from the main thoroughfare, while the snow muffled sounds that might otherwise have attracted attention. 2 operatives approached Hassan from different directions, their convergence timed to occur simultaneously at a point where the street's configuration limited his options for escape. The approach was measured, professional, devoid of the urgency that might have alerted the target to danger before the critical moment. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds, though accounts of what precisely occurred varied in later reconstructions. What is confirmed is that Hassan recognized the threat in the final moments, his training enabling assessment that came too late to permit effective response. The operatives who approached him were prepared for resistance that his skills might have provided, their own capabilities matching or exceeding what he could bring to a confrontation he had not anticipated. The sounds of the encounter were brief and largely absorbed by the snow-covered environment, leaving witnesses uncertain about what they had heard or whether anything significant had occurred. Hassan fell on snow that quickly began absorbing the evidence of what had transpired, the cold preserving a scene that warmer conditions would have altered within minutes. The operatives who had executed the mission confirmed the outcome before beginning withdrawal along routes that extraction planning had established. Their departure from the immediate area occurred within 90 seconds of the confrontation, the speed reflecting both thorough preparation and the urgency of avoiding response that the sounds of the encounter might have triggered. By the time West Berlin police received reports of a possible disturbance, the team had already scattered into the night. The body discovered by German police approximately 40 minutes after the operation contained documentation identifying the deceased as a Lebanese national traveling under a name that would later prove to be an alias. The wounds that had caused death were consistent with close-range confrontation involving both firearms and other weapons, though the specific instruments used could not be immediately determined. The snow that surrounded the body had been disturbed by what investigators assessed as multiple individuals, though tracking their movements proved impossible given the conditions and the time that had elapsed before discovery. The identification of the deceased as Mahmoud Khalid Hassan came through channels that connected German federal intelligence with Israeli counterparts, who provided information establishing the connection between the alias documents and the man they had hunted for years. The revelation transformed what German authorities had initially treated as a potential criminal matter into a case with international dimensions that exceeded their capacity to investigate independently. The involvement of foreign intelligence services became apparent through both the professional execution of the operation and the speed with which information about the victim's true identity emerged. The German government's response to the operation reflected the complex considerations that such incidents generated during the Cold War period. Officially, authorities investigated what they characterized as a homicide occurring on German soil, pursuing leads that they understood would prove unproductive. Unofficially, intelligence and diplomatic channels conveyed understanding that the elimination of a terrorist responsible for attacks across Europe served interests that Germany shared with Israel, even if the methods employed raised concerns about sovereignty and legal process. The investigation continued for the requisite period before concluding without resolution, the case file joining others where the perpetrators' identities remained formally unknown. The reaction within Palestinian movements combined expressions of grief for a fallen fighter with acknowledgement that his loss represented a significant setback for operational capabilities in Europe. The PFLP issued statements honoring Hassan as a martyr while providing no details about his activities that might confirm Israeli assessments of his responsibility for specific attacks. The cautious response reflected awareness that detailed acknowledgement would validate Israeli claims that had never been officially confirmed, creating complications for an organization that maintained political positions dependent on ambiguity about certain operations. Hassan became another name on lists of those who had died in the struggle, his specific contributions recognized only by those who had directed them. The intelligence community's assessment of the Berlin operation emphasized both tactical success and strategic implications that extended beyond the elimination of a single operative. The Red Wolf had represented a capability that few terrorist organizations possessed, a trained sniper who could strike targets across Europe with precision that conventional security measures could not adequately counter. His removal degraded PFLP's ability to conduct the specialized attacks that had generated such disproportionate impact relative to the resources required. The years of patient hunting had yielded results that validated the investment of resources and the approach that had ultimately proven successful. The operational lessons derived from the Berlin mission informed subsequent Mossad activities against targets who employed similar methodologies of evasion. The network monitoring approach that had eventually detected Hassan's contacts demonstrated effectiveness against targets who minimized direct communication while maintaining necessary connections to support infrastructure. The patience required to sustain such operations over years rather than months became institutionalized in planning assumptions that acknowledged the timelines involved in locating sophisticated adversaries. The methods that cornered the Red Wolf would be applied against others who believed that discipline and caution could protect them indefinitely. The broader implications of the operation touched on questions that similar incidents had repeatedly raised about the boundaries of legitimate action against terrorist threats. Critics argued that conducting assassinations on the territory of allied nations violated norms that civilized states were supposed to respect, that Israel's willingness to operate unilaterally undermined the international cooperation that counterterrorism ultimately required. Defenders countered that Hassan had demonstrated immunity to conventional law enforcement approaches, that his continued operation would have produced additional victims whose lives weighed against abstract concerns about process. The debate continued without resolution, each side invoking principles that the other considered subordinate to competing values. The families of those killed in attacks attributed to the Red Wolf received notification through various channels that the perpetrator of their losses had been brought to justice, though the term itself carried meaning that differed from conventional legal understanding. The closure that some found in this knowledge coexisted with recognition that no outcome could restore what had been taken, that the dead remained dead regardless of what happened to those responsible for their deaths. The satisfaction available to survivors was limited and incomplete, an acknowledgement of ending rather than true resolution of grief that such losses generated. The PFLP's operational capabilities in Europe declined measurably following Hassan's elimination, though attributing this decline solely to his removal would oversimplify the multiple factors involved. The organization faced pressure from multiple directions during this period. with security services across Europe intensifying efforts against Palestinian networks following years of attacks that had demonstrated their vulnerability. Hassan's death removed a unique capability, while the broader crackdown degraded the infrastructure that any successor would have required. The combination produced a reduction in attacks that brought relief to Jewish communities that had lived under threat throughout the decade. The Cold War context that had shaped both Hassan's development and the operation that ended his career would transform dramatically within months of the Berlin mission. The changes that swept Eastern Europe during 1989 eliminated the sanctuary that East Germany had provided to terrorists who exploited the divided continent's geography. The Stasi officers who had trained Hassan and may have provided support during his years of operation found themselves facing exposure and prosecution as the regime they served collapsed. The world in which the Red Wolf had hunted no longer existed, its passing making his methods obsolete, even had he survived to continue employing them. The documentation of the Berlin operation remained largely classified for decades, with accounts emerging only through the memoirs of participants who wrote after retirement and the investigative journalism of researchers who pieced together fragments from multiple sources. The full story of how Mossad identified, located, and eliminated the Red Wolf may never be completely reconstructed, as the participants protected sources and methods that retained value long after the specific operation concluded. What can be established confirms an operation that combined years of patient intelligence work with decisive action when opportunity finally presented itself. The snow that fell on Berlin during January 1988 eventually melted, erasing physical evidence of what had occurred in a narrow street off the Kurfürstendamm. The city that had served as Cold War's most dramatic stage would soon witness the fall of the wall that had divided it for decades, transforming into a symbol of reunification rather than confrontation. The people who walked streets where the operation occurred knew nothing of the history their steps traversed, the violence that had ended a life and concluded a hunt that had spanned years and continents, fading into the anonymity that characterizes events known only to participants and the small community of those who study such matters. The legacy of the Red Wolf survived in the communities he had terrorized, where the memory of attacks conducted in his campaign of violence remained vivid for those who had experienced them directly. Survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, the wounds of encounters with a precision that had seemed almost inhuman in its mechanical efficiency. The synagogues and restaurants and cultural centers he had targeted, rebuilt, and continued their functions, their persistence a form of defiance against those who had sought to make Jewish life in Europe impossible. The threat he had represented had been eliminated, though the hatred that had motivated him persisted in others who would take up similar causes with different methods. The operatives who had executed the Berlin mission returned to Israel and to subsequent assignments that their success had helped make possible. The skills they had demonstrated in cornering a target who had eluded capture for years would be applied against others who posed threats to Israeli security, the capabilities developed through one operation informing approaches to challenges that followed. Their identities remained protected by the secrecy that surrounded intelligence operations, their contributions known only to colleagues who operated within the same classified world. The satisfaction of success was private, shared among those who understood what had been accomplished. The hunt for the Red Wolf represented one episode in a broader campaign against terrorism that Israel had conducted since its earliest days, a campaign that continued long after the Berlin operation and continues into the present. Each operation informed those that followed, building institutional knowledge about how sophisticated adversaries could be located and neutralized despite the protective measures they employed. The patience that the hunt required became a template for subsequent efforts against targets who proved similarly elusive, demonstrating that eventually, even the most careful could be found by those with sufficient determination and resources. The divided city where the operation concluded would soon transform into a unified capital, its geography no longer offering the advantages that Hassan had exploited during his years of operation. The crossing points that had provided escape routes became tourist attractions where visitors photographed remnants of infrastructure that had once separated worlds. The Berlin, where the Red Wolf had hunted and died, belonged to an era that receded rapidly into history, its conflicts and alignments giving way to new challenges that would occupy attention in decades to come. The Cold War that had shaped so much of the terrorist landscape faded, replaced by threats that emerged from different sources and required different responses. The files documenting the Red Wolf and the operation that ended his career rested in archives whose contents would be reviewed by future generations seeking to understand a period whose assumptions and alignments might seem foreign to those who had not lived through them. The decisions made by intelligence officers and political leaders, the risks accepted and the methods employed, would be judged by standards that might differ from those prevailing when the operation occurred. History's verdict on such matters remained perpetually pending, each generation bringing perspectives shaped by experiences that the participants could not have anticipated. The snow that fell on Berlin during that January belonged to the same weather patterns that sent precipitation across Europe year after year, natural cycles indifferent to the human events that occurred beneath their influence. The cold that had complicated surveillance while muffling the sounds of confrontation was simply winter asserting itself, as it always did, the city's residents and visitors, navigating conditions they accepted as normal for the season. The operation that occurred during those frigid days was extraordinary, but the environment that hosted it was merely ordinary, the backdrop of daily life against which violence erupted and then subsided. The Red Wolf had believed that his skills and discipline would protect him from those who hunted him, that the tradecraft absorbed through years of training would prove superior to the methods his pursuers employed. His confidence was not entirely unfounded, as he had evaded detection for years while conducting operations that demonstrated exceptional capability. But the resources arrayed against him exceeded what any individual could indefinitely overcome, the patience of those who sought him matching and ultimately exceeding his own. The hunt had lasted years, but it had only one possible conclusion once the hunters committed fully to achieving it. For 6 years, the sniper known as the Red Wolf terrorized Jewish communities across Europe with precision attacks that conventional security could not prevent. Mahmoud Khalid Hassan had been trained by East German intelligence, funded by Palestinian factions, and protected by Cold War geography that allowed him to strike in the west while retreating to the east. The network monitoring that Mossad sustained for years finally detected his presence in Berlin, and on a snowy January night in 1988, operatives cornered him in a narrow street where his legendary caution could not save him.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.